The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as Princess Elena stood at the tall windows of her private chambers. Her delicate fingers traced patterns on the cold glass while she watched the royal gardens below. The roses were in full bloom, their red petals dancing in the gentle breeze, but Elena could not find joy in their beauty today. For months now, the weight of court life had pressed down upon her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The endless ceremonies, the whispered gossip behind silk fans, and the constant scrutiny of every gesture had slowly drained the light from her once bright spirit. Elena had arrived in Valdoria 3 years ago as a young princess from the neighboring kingdom of Serenia, full of hope and dreams for her future with Prince Alexander. Alexander had been everything she could have wished for in a husband. Tall and handsome with kind blue eyes, he possessed a gentle nature that contrasted beautifully with his strong leadership abilities. Their courtship had been like something from a fairy tale, with moonlit walks through the palace gardens and stolen kisses behind the ancient oak trees. When he had asked for her hand in marriage, Elena's heart had soared with happiness. But marriage had brought unexpected challenges. Queen Regent Isabel, Alexander's mother, had made it clear from the very beginning that Elena was not the bride she would have chosen for her son. Isabel was a woman of sharp intelligence and even sharper tongue, with silver hair pulled back in a severe style and cold gray eyes that seemed to see through everyone around her. She had ruled Valdoria as regent since her husband's death 10 years ago, and she was not ready to share her power with a young princess from another kingdom. Every suggestion Elena made was quietly dismissed. Every tradition she tried to bring from Serenia was politely but firmly rejected. When Elena had proposed building a new orphanage in the lower districts of the capital city, Isabel had explained that such matters were already being handled adequately. When Elena had organized a harvest festival to celebrate with the common people, Isabel had made sure it was moved to a remote location where few could attend. The final blow had come just 2 weeks ago during the spring council meeting. Elena had carefully prepared a proposal to establish trade agreements with the eastern kingdoms, something that could bring prosperity to Valdoria's struggling farming communities. She had spent months researching, consulting with advisors, and drafting detailed plans. But when she rose to speak at the council meeting, Isabel had interrupted her. Before she could even begin, "Princess Elena," Isabel had said in her cool, measured voice, "while we appreciate your enthusiasm, such complex matters of state require years of experience to understand properly. Perhaps you might focus your energies on more suitable pursuits, such as organizing the Ladies' Tea Society or planning the next royal garden party." The other council members had shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none had spoken in Elena's defense. Even Alexander, though he had looked troubled, had remained silent. That silence had cut deeper than any harsh words could have. That night, Elena had confronted Alexander in their private sitting room. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, and the familiar scent of jasmine from her favorite candles filled the air. But the atmosphere between them was tense. "Why didn't you support me today?" Elena had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know, my proposal had merit. The eastern kingdoms are eager to trade, and our farmers need new markets for their goods." Alexander had run his hands through his dark hair, a gesture she knew meant he was struggling with something difficult. "Elena, you have to understand. My mother has been ruling this kingdom for 10 years. She knows things about statecraft that we're still learning. Sometimes it's better to trust her judgment." "But what about my judgment?" Elena had replied, tears beginning to form in her green eyes. "I'm not a child, Alexander. I'm your wife, and I'm supposed to be the future queen of this realm. How can I ever truly serve our people if I'm not allowed to contribute anything meaningful?" Alexander had tried to take her hands, but Elena had pulled away. "You are contributing," he had insisted. "You're beautiful and gracious, and the people love you. Isn't that enough?" Those words had revealed the truth that Elena had been trying to ignore for months. To Alexander, to his mother, to the entire court, she was nothing more than an ornament, a pretty princess who looked lovely in portraits and smiled appropriately at state dinners. Her intelligence, her ideas, her desire to make a real difference in people's lives. None of that mattered. The decision to leave had not come easily. Elena had spent sleepless nights pacing the floors of her chambers, weighing her love for Alexander against her need to find purpose and meaning in her life. She had tried to imagine staying, tried to picture herself growing old in a palace where her voice would never truly be heard. The thought filled her with a despair so deep it took her breath away. 3 days ago, Elena had received a letter from her older sister, Princess Catherine, who ruled a small but prosperous duchy in the northern mountains. Catherine had written about establishing a new academy for young women, a place where girls could learn not just embroidery and music, but also mathematics, philosophy, and the arts of governance. She had invited Elena to help her create this revolutionary institution. The letter had felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in deep water. Here was a chance to do something meaningful, to use her education and intelligence for a purpose that mattered. Catherine had always understood Elena's ambitions, and had never made her feel foolish for wanting more than a life of pretty dresses and empty ceremonies. Yesterday, Elena had made her final decision. She had written a careful letter to Catherine accepting her invitation, and had begun making quiet arrangements for her departure. Her most trusted maid, Maria, had helped her pack her essential belongings in secret. Elena had chosen to take only her most precious personal items: her mother's pearl necklace, a few beloved books, and the small portrait of Alexander that she had treasured since their engagement. Now, as she stood at the window watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Elena knew that this would be her last morning in Valdoria. In just a few hours, she would have to face Alexander and tell him of her decision. She would have to see the hurt and confusion in his kind blue eyes, and somehow find the strength to walk away from the only man she had ever loved. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside her door told Elena that her time for solitary reflection was coming to an end. Soon the palace would be fully awake, and she would have to begin the most difficult day of her life. She pressed her palm against the cool glass one last time, whispered a quiet goodbye to the gardens below, and turned to prepare for the heartbreak that lay ahead. The great hall of Valdoria Palace had never felt so vast and empty as it did on this gray afternoon. Elena had requested to meet Alexander here, away from the private intimacy of their shared chambers, knowing that she would need the formal grandeur of this space to help her maintain her composure. The ancient tapestries depicting the glorious history of Valdoria hung motionless on the walls, and the afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across the polished marble floor. Alexander entered through the massive oak doors with his usual confident stride, but Elena could see the concern written across his features. She had sent him a formal message requesting his presence, something they had never done in their 3 years of marriage. The unusual formality had clearly troubled him, and his blue eyes searched her face immediately for answers. "Elena, what's wrong?" he asked, crossing the hall toward her with quick steps. "You look so serious. Has something happened? Is your family well?" Elena stood beside one of the tall stone pillars, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had chosen to wear her traveling dress, a simple but elegant gown of deep blue wool that would be practical for the long journey ahead. Around her neck, she wore her mother's pearl necklace, drawing strength from the memory of the strong woman who had raised her to believe in herself. "Please sit down, Alexander," Elena said quietly, gesturing toward the ornate chairs that had been arranged near the great fireplace. Her voice was steady, but Alexander knew her well enough to detect the underlying tremor of emotion. "I'd rather stand if you don't mind," Alexander replied, moving closer to her. "Elena, you're frightening me. Whatever it is, we can face it together. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Supporting each other through difficult times." The genuine love and concern in his voice nearly broke Elena's resolve. This was the man she had fallen in love with. Kind, caring, always ready to protect those he cherished. But love alone had not been enough to overcome the barriers that stood between them. Love had not given her a voice in his mother's court, and love had not made him see that she needed more than his protection. "I'm leaving Valdoria," Elena said simply. The words falling into the silence like stones dropped into still water. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, as if the words had been spoken in a foreign language that he was struggling to translate. "Leaving? Leaving? He repeated. What do you mean? Are you going to visit your sister? Your father? How long will you be away? Elena shook her head slowly, tears beginning to gather in her green eyes despite all her efforts to remain strong. I'm not coming back, Alexander. I'm going to live with Catherine in the Northern Duchy. She's starting an academy for young women, and she's asked me to help her establish it. I've accepted her invitation. The color drained from Alexander's face as the full meaning of her words struck him. He took a step backward, his hand reaching out to grip the back of a nearby chair for support. You can't be serious. This is your home. I am your husband. We made vows before God and our people, and I have tried to honor those vows, Elena replied, her voice growing stronger as she spoke the truth that had been burning in her heart. I have tried to be the wife you wanted, the princess your kingdom expected. But I cannot continue to live as a decoration in a palace where my thoughts and dreams don't matter. Alexander's expression shifted from shock to desperation. He moved toward her again, reaching out as if to take her hands, but Elena stepped back, maintaining the distance between them. Elena, if this is about what happened at the council meeting, I can speak to my mother. I can make sure your voice is heard in the future. Things can change. Can they really? Elena asked, and now the tears were flowing freely down her cheeks. Alexander, I have been here for 3 years. 3 years of being told that my ideas are too ambitious, my proposals too complex, my dreams too grand for a woman to understand. 3 years of watching your mother dismiss everything I try to contribute while you stand silently by her side. That's not fair, Alexander protested, his own eyes growing wet with unshed tears. You know I love you. You know I value your intelligence and your compassion. The council meetings, the political discussions, those are complicated situations. I can't just override my mother's authority without considering the consequences. And that is precisely the problem, Elena said with a sad smile. You cannot see that your silence is also a choice. When you fail to support me, when you allow your mother to dismiss me as if I were a child, you are choosing her authority over our partnership. You are choosing the easy path over the right one. The great doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Queen Regent Isabel entered with her usual regal bearing. She wore a gown of deep purple velvet, and her silver hair was adorned with a small diamond tiara that caught the light as she walked. Her gray eyes took in the scene before her with sharp intelligence. Elena's tear-stained face, Alexander's obvious distress, the tension that filled the air like smoke from a fire. I hope I'm not interrupting something important, Isabel said in her cool, measured voice, though it was clear from her expression that she suspected exactly what was happening. Mother, please, Alexander said without turning away from Elena. Not now. This is a private conversation between my wife and me. But Isabel continued forward, her silk shoes clicking against the marble floor with precise, calculated steps. I'm afraid privacy is a luxury we cannot afford when matters of state are involved, and from the look of things, this conversation very much involves matters of state. Elena turned to face the Queen Regent, drawing herself up to her full height with the dignity that had been bred into her since childhood. Your Majesty, she said with a formal curtsy, since you are here, perhaps it would be best if I told you directly. I am leaving Valdoria today to take up residence with my sister in the Northern Duchy. If Isabel felt any surprise at this announcement, her face showed none of it. Instead, a small smile played at the corners of her mouth, not a warm expression of understanding, but something cold and satisfied, like a chess player who had just seen their opponent make an inevitable move into checkmate. How unfortunate, Isabel said, her voice carrying no trace of genuine regret. Though perhaps not entirely unexpected. I have observed that some people simply are not suited for the demands of royal life, the sacrifices required, the discipline needed to put duty before personal desires. These qualities cannot be taught to those who do not possess them naturally. Alexander spun around to face his mother, his face flushing with anger. Mother, that's enough. Elena is my wife, and she deserves your respect. And she has had my respect, Isabel replied smoothly. I have treated her with all the courtesy due to her position, but respect does not mean pretending that someone is suited for roles they cannot fulfill. If the princess has decided that she would be happier pursuing educational endeavors in a small provincial duchy, then perhaps that is indeed where she belongs. The cruel dismissal in Isabel's words hit Elena like a physical blow, but she refused to let the Queen Regent see how deeply they wounded her. Instead, she lifted her chin and met Isabel's cold gaze with quiet dignity. "You are quite right, Your Majesty," Elena said, in a voice that rang clear through the hall. "I am not suited for a life where intelligence is seen as a flaw and ambition as a fault. I am not suited for a court where a woman's worth is measured only by her ability to remain silent and look decorative. If that makes me unworthy of Valdoria, then I accept that judgment gladly." Alexander looked between his wife and his mother, his face a mask of anguish and confusion. Elena could see the war raging within him, his love for her battling against a lifetime of deference to his mother's will. For a moment, she hoped that he might finally find the courage to choose their love over Isabel's approval. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, his silence spoke louder than any words could have. Elena nodded slowly, understanding that this was her final answer. She walked to where Alexander stood and reached up to touch his face gently, memorizing the feel of his skin beneath her fingertips. "I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "I will always love you. But I cannot love you enough to disappear completely. I hope someday you will understand." Alexander caught her hand in his, holding it against his cheek as tears streamed down his face. "Don't go," he whispered back. "Please, Elena. We can find another way. Give me time to make things right." But Elena shook her head sadly, pulling her hand free from his grasp. "Time will not change the fundamental truth, my darling. You will always be your mother's son before you are my husband, and I will always need more from life than a golden cage, no matter how beautiful it might be." She turned away from him then, walking toward the great doors with measured steps that echoed through the silent hall. At the threshold, she paused and looked back one final time. Alexander stood frozen in place, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, while Isabel watched Elena's departure with that same cold, satisfied smile. "Goodbye," Elena said simply, and then she was gone, leaving behind only the echo of her footsteps and the shattered remains of a fairy tale that had never been meant to last. 6 months had passed since Princess Elena's carriage had disappeared through the palace gates, taking with it the last traces of laughter that had once echoed through the corridors of Valdoria Palace. The autumn rains drummed against the windows with relentless persistence, matching the gray melancholy that had settled over the kingdom like a heavy blanket. Prince Alexander stood in his study, staring at the latest reports from the kingdom's agricultural districts. The harvest had been poor this year, and the farmers were struggling to feed their families through the approaching winter. Several neighboring kingdoms had offered favorable trade agreements, but Alexander found himself unable to focus on the details. Every document on his desk reminded him of Elena's carefully prepared proposal from months ago, the one his mother had so quickly dismissed. The irony was not lost on him. The eastern kingdoms Elena had wanted to establish trade relations with were now approaching Valdoria with exactly the kind of agreements she had envisioned. But without her detailed research and diplomatic connections, the negotiations were proceeding slowly and producing far less favorable terms than might have been possible. Alexander rubbed his tired eyes and walked to the window overlooking the gardens. The roses Elena had loved were brown and withered now, waiting for the gardeners to cut them back for winter. He had forbidden anyone from touching them, though he could not say why. Perhaps because they were the last living things that had brought her joy in this place. The sound of sharp footsteps in the hallway announced his mother's approach before she knocked on his door. Queen Regent Isabel entered without waiting for permission, as was her custom, carrying a leather portfolio filled with what he knew would be more pressing matters requiring his attention. "Alexander," she said briskly, settling into the chair across from his desk with practiced efficiency. "We need to discuss the delegation from the Kingdom of Astoria. Princess Margareta has arrived for the trade negotiations, and there are certain opportunities we should consider." Alexander turned away from the window, his expression carefully neutral. In the months since Elena's departure, He had learned to mask his emotions when dealing with his mother. What kind of opportunities? Isabel smiled the same cold smile that had marked Elena's final moments in the palace. Princess Margareta is 22 years old, well-educated, and quite attractive. More importantly, she represents significant political advantages. A marriage alliance with Astoria would secure our southern borders and provide access to their rich silver mines. The suggestion hit Alexander like a physical blow. Marriage? Mother, I am already married. Have you forgotten that detail? I have forgotten nothing, Isabel replied smoothly. But you must face reality. Your wife abandoned her duties and her vows. She chose to pursue her own selfish desires over the welfare of this kingdom. The church and the court would support an annulment under such circumstances. Alexander's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Elena did not abandon anything. She was driven away by your constant undermining and my own cowardice in allowing it to happen. For the first time since Elena's departure, Isabel's composure cracked slightly. Her gray eyes flashed with anger as she rose from her chair. Your cowardice? How dare you suggest that I am responsible for that girl's failure to adapt to her responsibilities? I have guided this kingdom through 10 years of prosperity and peace. Every decision I made was for the good of Valdoria, including the decision to crush every attempt Elena made to contribute something meaningful. Alexander shot back, his own anger finally breaking free after months of suppression. Including the decision to treat her like a decorative object rather than a future queen with ideas worth considering. Those ideas were naive and poorly thought out, Isabel snapped. She was a child playing at statecraft, and indulging her fantasies would have been dangerous to our stability. Alexander strode to his desk and pulled out a thick folder that had been gathering dust for months. These are copies of Elena's trade proposals, he said, throwing the papers down between them. I've had our best diplomatic advisors review them. Every single one has confirmed that her research was thorough, her analysis was sound, and her suggested approaches were not only feasible but potentially very profitable for our kingdom. Isabel's face paled as she stared at the documents. You had her work reviewed? Without consulting me? Yes, Alexander said firmly, because I finally decided to see for myself whether her ideas had merit. And what I discovered was that my wife, my brilliant, capable wife, had developed plans that could have strengthened our economy and improved the lives of our people. Plans that you dismissed without even reading them properly. The Queen Regent's composure returned like armor sliding back into place. Even if her proposals had some merit, her attitude was unacceptable. A princess cannot simply demand to be heard. There are proper channels, established protocols. The proper channel was supposed to be through me, Alexander said quietly. I was supposed to support her, to ensure her voice was heard and her contributions valued. Instead, I let you silence her because it was easier than standing up to you. I failed her, Mother. And in failing her, I failed this kingdom. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the north, Princess Elena stood in the bright, book-filled library of the Mountain Academy for Young Women. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the eager faces of 24 girls ranging in age from 12 to 18. They sat at wooden desks with notebooks open, hanging on every word of Elena's lecture about the principles of diplomatic negotiation. Remember, Elena was saying, her voice warm with enthusiasm. The goal of any negotiation is not to defeat your opponent, but to find solutions that benefit everyone involved. A good diplomat learns to listen as carefully as she speaks. One of the older girls raised her hand. Princess Elena, what if the other party refuses to listen to your ideas just because you're a woman? Elena smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her green eyes. That is unfortunately still a common challenge, Sarah, but we cannot control other people's prejudices. We can only control our own response to them. Sometimes it means finding allies who will carry your ideas forward. Sometimes it means proving your worth through smaller successes until you earn the right to be heard on larger matters. And sometimes, she paused, looking out the window toward the distant mountains. It means having the courage to walk away from situations where your voice will never be valued. No matter how loudly you speak, After the lesson ended, Elena walked through the academy's gardens with her sister Catherine. The mountain air was crisp and clean, and the late afternoon sun painted the peaks around them in shades of gold and purple. Elena had grown healthier in the months since her arrival, her cheeks flushed with color and her step lighter than it had been in years. "Another letter came from Valdoria today," Catherine mentioned casually, pulling an unopened envelope from her pocket. "It's from Alexander again." Elena took the letter but did not open it immediately. This was the 7th letter he had sent in the past 2 months, and she knew what it would contain. Apologies, explanations, pleas for her to return, and promises that things would be different. Each letter was harder to read than the last, because she could hear the genuine pain in his words and feel the echo of her own heartbreak. "The girls adore you," Catherine said, changing the subject with the gentle tact that Elena remembered from their childhood. "Sarah told me yesterday that you've inspired her to pursue a diplomatic career. She wants to become an ambassador to the Eastern Kingdoms." "She has the intelligence for it," Elena replied, tucking Alexander's letter into her pocket unread. "They all do. That's what makes this work so rewarding. These girls don't need anyone's permission to be brilliant. They just need someone to show them that brilliance is something to celebrate, not hide." "And what about you?" Catherine asked softly. "Are you happy here? Truly happy?" Elena considered the question carefully as they walked past beds of hardy mountain flowers that bloomed despite the approaching winter. "I am content," she said finally. "There is purpose in my days and hope for the future. The girls challenge me. The work fulfills me. And I sleep peacefully at night, knowing that I am building something meaningful. Is that the same as happiness? I'm not sure. But it's more than I had in Valdoria." That evening, Elena finally opened Alexander's letter in the privacy of her simple but comfortable quarters. His handwriting was as familiar as her own heartbeat, and his words carried the weight of genuine remorse and understanding. "My dearest Elena." The letter began. "I write to you not with false hopes of convincing you to return, but with the simple need to tell you that I finally understand what I lost. Your proposals for the Eastern trade agreements have proven to be exactly as brilliant as you claimed. We have implemented modified versions of your plans, and they are already bringing prosperity to our farming communities. Every success reminds me of my failure to support you when it mattered most. I have also dismissed 3 of Mother's appointments to the Royal Council and replaced them with advisors who value diverse perspectives over traditional protocols. It is a small step, but it is a beginning. I wish I could tell you that I have found the courage to stand fully against her influence, but honesty compels me to admit that some chains are harder to break than others. I do not write to ask you to forgive me, though I hope someday you might. I write simply to let you know that your voice is finally being heard in Valdoria, even in your absence. The academy you are building sounds wonderful, and I am proud of the important work you are doing. Our kingdom's loss has been the Mountain Duchy's great gain. I love you still, and I always will. I hope you are finding the happiness and fulfillment that I was too weak to protect when you were here. Your devoted husband. Alexander. Elena read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the wooden box where she kept his other messages. She walked to her window and looked out at the star-filled sky, feeling the familiar mixture of love and sorrow that Alexander's words always brought. In Valdoria Palace, Alexander stood at his own window, wondering if Elena might be looking at the same stars. Queen Regent Isabel had finally stopped mentioning Princess Margareta and marriage annulments, perhaps realizing that her son was beyond her influence in this matter. The kingdom functioned well enough under their joint leadership, but Alexander knew that something vital had been lost when Elena left. Not just his personal happiness, but a vision of what Valdoria could have become with her wisdom and compassion guiding its future. The autumn wind rattled the palace windows, carrying with it the promise of a long, cold winter ahead. But far to the north, in a mountain academy filled with the laughter of young women learning to believe in their own potential, Princess Elena was helping to plant the seeds of a warmer spring that would bloom not just in her own life, but in the lives of all the girls she was teaching to find their voices and use them fearlessly. The fairy tale had ended, but perhaps something better had begun in its place. Not a story of perfect love conquering all obstacles, but a story of a woman who had found the courage to choose herself when no one else would choose her, and who was using that hard-won wisdom to light the way for others walking similar paths.